Yes, indeed, boo. Yes, indeed, hiss.
The Organization of Afro-American Unity sees the only hope for the black man in America in a strong Africa, and the necessity of the Afro-American becoming inseparably linked with the overall program that's existing on the African continent. The two problems must be solved together, and the two forces must go forward together. And so the Organization of Afro-American Unity has a program to link the Afro-Americans with the Africans and the Africans with the Afro-Americans. When I say Afro-Americans, I mean those throughout the entire Western Hemisphere. This is our only hope. Our hope is in a strong Africa. And when Africa is strong, our position in America will be one of respect. But if Africa is weak, we will never be in a position of respect in America.
Welcome to the Michael Brooks Show. We're broadcasting live from downtown Brooklyn, USA, where left is best as it is everywhere else, with super producer Matt Leck.
Hello.
Chief economist David Griscom.
How's it going?
How's it going? Good. How are you, David?
I'm not bad at all,
That is a
man.
question that demands an answer. We were so slick for 30 seconds. Super producer David Slavic in the digitosphere, collecting your questions in the Discord, monitoring the scene. Forrest, Artesia, the whole crew on this week's program. Maytha Alhassen, she's joining us from the West Coast. She's a journalist, PhD, academic. We're talking about the uprisings in the Sudan and Algeria, how they relate to that historical understanding of Malcolm X, and then the great, the iconic Anna Kasparian. We were with her in LA last week. Now she's with us in Brooklyn today. She's coming. She's here. She's in studio. She's already arrived. And we're gonna watch. This is the most YouTube shit I've ever said in my life. We're gonna watch her reaction to Dave Rubin's reaction of his reaction to her telling the truth about him. And then after we have fun doing that, we're gonna talk about why Joe Biden and Pete Buttigieg, they just get it so wrong in so many ways. Watching Pete Buttigieg interact with Al Sharpton, I legitimately think that the only other black person he ever interacted with was the police chief he fired. But we'll get to that and much, much more, including, of course, in the post game where we will do. Anna's going to stick around with us for all of it, for the debunk, for Bad, where that opposition figure's daughter from Venezuela is back on the scene.
No good, really bad for you.
No good and really bad for you. We have a shout out recognizing 25 years of the end of the apartheid regime in South Africa as the ANC gears up for a re-election campaign. Thabo Mbeki re-emerges, and we're talking about the relationship between Cuba and the African National Congress in the Shoutout. Grisham is going to get us up to date on the Stop and Shop protests and how that relates to some new Trump travesties towards working people. And Lula da Silva, he finally was allowed to speak to the press, and he reminded everybody that he's one of the best politicians on the planet.
And one of the best voices.
Definitely one of the best voices. This will give us an opportunity to play Lula voice. You know, Gene Bajlan has a good Lula impression. I think we need to bring the Lula impression back. All that and much, much more on this week's Michael Brooks Show. But let's start with the fact that today in Venezuela, there was yet another attempt at a coup. And I don't know how to handle this because it's very serious. It's profoundly dangerous. It's U.S. hegemony. And there's a lot of obvious lessons we should be drawing from this. It's also farcical. Juan Guaido is going on Periscope every couple of weeks to try to instigate a coup. And while I have no problem acknowledging some of the abuses and failings of the current Maduro government, I am legitimately starting to ask myself at this point, when the fuck does this guy get put in prison for trying to institute a violent coup every other week with the backing of a hostile foreign power? This is Mike Pompeo, who really is one of the most dangerous people on the planet, talking with Wolf Blitzer today about how Russia apparently has kept the Maduro government in place.
Wolf, we've watched throughout the day. It's been a long time since anyone has seen Maduro. He had an airplane on the tarmac. He was ready to leave this morning, as we understand it, and the Russians indicated he should stay. We think the situation remains incredibly fluid. We know that there were senior leaders inside the Maduro government that were prepared to leave. They told us as much over the past few weeks, and we're convinced that the Venezuelan people are going to get their democracy back.
Now, obviously, don't ever believe a word that Mike Pompeo says about anything. But what's really interesting is, look, I'll make a broader geostrategic point. One, as I've said before, for the same reason that I want U.S. forces in position to protect Kurdish fighters in that particular geopolitical situation in Syria, I want them there. I support that presence. And I support Russian presence in Venezuela to avert further U.S. hostility. Rumors are flying right now that there might be an aircraft carrier headed towards Venezuela. That's not confirmed, and it could just be simply not true or disinformation. But the bigger point here that is actually astonishing to absorb, again, because I'm willing to acknowledge the internal failures within Venezuela, is the fact that what this case proves is that there is no question that the Venezuelan government has a huge or significant amount of organic indigenous support for it. And it's not really that shocking why that would be the case. One, this is a government that, going back to the Chavez days, absolutely did a very significant amount to redistribute wealth, relieve poverty, generate literacy, and help a lot of people, the people that are not represented in U.S. coverage of Venezuela or anywhere else in Latin America, the Middle East, Africa, or Asia, or anywhere else where the sort of U.S. imperial impulse is. Then there's the broader opposition, which is that most people, even if they happen to hate the government that is in charge of them, do not want an external government forcing change on them. And this is now going back early into the Chavez government. There was a 48-hour coup when Chavez was president. The New York Times endorsed it. The Bush administration denied involvement. But what happened was that Chavez was flown out of the presidential palace. He was put in prison. And there was both a massive uprising on the street in support of him, as well as his literally persuading his own prison guards to fly him back and reinstall him in the palace. So there is real support here, and the support is for obvious reasons, and there's never any reason to airbrush or pretend that there haven't been abuses and failings in order to state the obvious case, that there's real support here and real opposition to a coup. Now, the other part that is actually much more critical of present Venezuelan politics and the formation of the Bolivarian government, they're not going to get military leaders to defect. Senior military leaders that have spoken out so far have not defected, and they have never historically defected. Now, maybe they will in another couple of weeks. The pressure is obviously unrelenting. But the truth of the matter is, and this is, again, it's a criticism because this government is very highly militarized. On the other hand, witness the treatment of leaders like Lula that didn't follow that course. So if the Venezuelans are able to maintain this by cutting deals with cartels, by letting the military play a significant role in public and economic life, think of what you have done to the leaders in Latin America that have, quote unquote, played by the rules. So there's no doubt that there's organic support, that this is, as of now, another total failure of a coup, and also that the Trump administration is profoundly committed to a coup, and that most of the crisis there is generated by this relentless external pressure. In fact, if you stopped all of the sanctions and harassment, maybe you could give it an opportunity for organic unrest to develop. But international fascism has picked its candidate. Earlier today, Jair Bolsonaro tweeted out his sympathies with the quote-unquote suffering of the Venezuelan people enslaved by a dictator, and used it, of course, to attack the PT and PASAL. Bolsonaro intervenes. John Bolton, another one of the most dangerous people on the planet, has been on a media blitz and has even threatened individual leaders of the Venezuelan military. Eric Prince senses a great opportunity to get out of business in China, Afghanistan, and the Emirates. Don't forget him. The founder of Blackwater, Betsy DeVos's brother, is pitching his services to send mercenaries into Venezuela to install Guaido into government. So these are the choices. There is nothing, again, I will say a million times, you do not need to pretend that this government is perfect, that this government doesn't have flaws. Conversely, when you are pushed to a clear wall and there is a choice, in my view, you have to oppose imperialism and you have to oppose U.S. intervention. And if you think that U.S. intervention, I think as Owen Jones put it earlier today, is anything other than enormously damaging to the Venezuelan people, then you either are completely and utterly historically illiterate or a poorly intentioned person. So that is what it is. And I just got to leave on this. This is actually, I caught this because Anna tweeted it out. Maybe we'll touch on it later. But this is Donna Shalala, who's sort of like, I mean, she's just the kind of embodiment of almost everything wrong in the modern Democratic Party. And this should be actually an example of props for Senator Sanders, who as of today has still maintained, and I know people don't like all of his rhetoric, and I think in the humanitarian aid case, he made a substantive mistake in terms of supporting that shipment because of the politics around it. But the truth of the matter is like, he's opposed an invasion, and he's not going to come out tomorrow and go, Nicolas Maduro is doing what we want to do in the United States. So just, chill. But he has opposed U.S. military action. And Donna Shalala is going to tweet out just this utterly trash piece, I think it's from Slate, on why Bernie has a quote-unquote soft spot for Latin American dictators. Now, Donna Shalala is a bag woman for the arms industry, for every far-right interest in Florida, which certainly have its own deep and profound sympathies for dictators in Latin America. And all of these things are not like each other. Like even the failings of these governments that are up in that shot, right? That's the leader of the Sandinistas, Daniel Ortega, who's now president of Nicaragua, and Fidel Castro, of course, and Nicolas Maduro. All of these people come from a place of resistance. And that resistance is not only justified, it's necessary. And it doesn't mean that everything they've done is right. And it doesn't mean in some cases that some of them haven't become horrible failures and abusive leaders. But if you can't understand the fundamental departure point between these leaders and a Bolsonaro or a Guaido or all of the numerous death squads and dictatorships and terrorists that we've backed in Latin America, once again, you're stupid or profoundly poor intentioned. And I don't know which Donna Shalala is. I don't know enough about her. I'm assuming going to go with blindly ideological and poorly intentioned. This is her and Debbie Wasserman Schultz. Man, we're really elevating the mood here. We got to see Debbie Wasserman Schultz too. Okay, go ahead.
It's from March 10th.
All right, this is from March 10th.
But of course, he will not. The container that he put on this bridge to block it says peace. There is no peace here. There are only, on the other side of this bridge, hungry people, starving children, children who are dying. We have medicines. The community, the Latin American community, Colombia, 50 different countries have contributed to make sure we can save the Venezuelan people.
Colombia, a government that got elected undermining the peace process with the FARC and is connected to the paramilitaries that have killed a huge amount of people in that country. So that's what the reality is. And that's why in times like this, you do need to be really clear, right? Like there's a difference between acknowledging the complexity of something, which I think we should all strive to do, versus just being like a nerdy pedant who's like, well, I don't know. You have to know in a situation like this, period. Let's get to the shout out. And later, we'll do Bill Maher, who supports Venezuela, because that's a funny bit. All right, I love DJ Danarchy, but I can't take all the song today. Respect, I'm sorry. The South African people are celebrating 25 years of defeating apartheid, and there's a lot of complexities in the ANC's governance record. Obviously, there's a lot of factions inside the African National Congress. The economic freedom fighters are emerging as a factor. The DA is the sort of like pure representation of Western and traditional South African or white capital interests, and there's also definitely a huge corruption and xenophobia there as well. But also the ANC is one of the most important and iconic and successful and brilliant political movements of the 20th century. And we need to honor them and all of their leadership, not just Nelson Mandela, but there was dozens of leaders produced by this movement inside South Africa, an internal resistance, like the current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, who organized mine unions in the 80s to destabilize the apartheid regime. The exile leaders like Thabo Mbeki, who pioneered cultural diplomacy and coordinated guerrilla movements in Europe and Southern Africa. And then also the Robben Islanders, which is where Nelson Mandela was, and the other people who were in prison for like decades in some cases as they struggled against the regime. This is an interesting clip, though, because again, as part of like acknowledging the reality of some of these governments, Cuba and Fidel Castro were instrumental in defeating apartheid. And Nelson Mandela, when he was going on a global tours in the early 90s, and every single person wanted to meet him, and he was gracious and loved meeting with everybody, from the Queen of England to George Herbert Walker Bush, but he also made very clear that he was not going to skip Cuba. And not only was he not going to skip Cuba, he was going to thank Castro for his role in supporting the defeat of apartheid in very serious material ways, while, you know, as an example, the CIA, it's pretty well documented, tipped off the South African security forces where Nelson Mandela was hiding. So this is a clip of Nelson Mandela and Fidel Castro. And Mandela's kind of grouchy here, actually.
Anything.
Antes de hablar absolutamente de cualquier tema,
You must tell me when you are coming to South
me
Africa.
tiene que decir cuándo viene para Sudáfrica.
He's real serious.
No, just a moment.
No. Un momentito.
Seguro, sí, yo recibí.
The sooner the better.
And we have had a visit from a wide
Y nos ha
variety of
visitado una
people.
gran cantidad de personas.
And our friend Cuba,
Y nuestro amigo Cuba,
which helped us in training our people,
que nos ayudó a entrenar a nuestra gente,
gave us resources to
que nos
get
dio
on with our
recursos,
struggle,
que nos ayudaron tanto en nuestra
trained
lucha,
our people
que
as
entrenó a nuestros
doctors and so
combatientes, a
on.
nuestros médicos.
You have not come to our country.
Cuba no ha venido a visitarnos, usted no ha ido a visitar.
When are you coming?
¿Cuándo viene?
No he visitado a mi patria
I
surafricana.
haven't visited my South African homeland
La
yet.
quiero como una patria.
I love it as a
Quiero por él
homeland.
y por el pueblo.
I love it as a homeland as I love you and the South
When
African
are you
people.
He's just like, no, seriously, when are you coming? Check out the BuzzFeed listicle on why Fidel wore Adidas tracksuits. Some deep history on the show and the sartorial choices. But that is a great history, and that's one, again, that you need to be real about what Cuba is. Don't ignore and pretend that there haven't been violations of people's rights and people fleeing the islands, but also don't pretend that there hasn't been consistent U.S. political terrorism. And I mean that literally. I mean, you can look up, unfortunately I'm forgetting his name, but we covered it when he died. There was that Cuban terrorist who blew up a civilian jet airliner flying to Cuba, who was arrested even in 2004 in Panama, plotting to assassinate Castro. And the Bush administration had his back, as the CIA had his back for decades. So that's one part of it. And then another part of it is universal health care for their people, universal literacy, backing all of these struggles, not only in South Africa, but in Angola, and deploying doctors to Venezuela, to Brazil, and now actually AMLO in Mexico. So that's a significant part of the illicit history frame of this show. And now we're going to do a little pitch, and then we're going to come back with Dr. Maytha Alhassen. And I apologize for all my worldliness. I'm really bad at pronunciations, so I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Oh, beautiful. All right, guys. You know what it is. It's time to become a patron of this show. We have a new offering, which we are giving to $21 and above patrons, Comrade and above patrons, which are video illicit histories. We released our first one yesterday. It was done by Vic Viana, who's an incredibly talented guy. He'll be back in studio soon. He's part of the crew now. He's working on the next two. The next two are going to be one on the history of Medicaid, which is based on the interview with Jamila Mishner, which was brilliant, and then another one on Brazil. This interview focused and documentary focused on the Jesse Jackson 1988 campaign and the Rainbow Coalition and the conversation we had with Bill Fletcher Jr. about it. It's incredibly well done, and what we're doing is we're giving them to those patrons at that level for about a month. And then when the new one comes up, we're going to unlock it and put it on YouTube because we do want to get this content out to as many people as possible. But by becoming a patron at that level, now in addition to the regular Skype calls, you can also watch those documentaries a month in advance and also give us feedback and topic suggestions. So that's the new offering. We haven't decided yet, but it looks, we're going to be announcing where the next live show is going to be pretty soon. So we'll probably know like next week. Meanwhile, everybody who's in LA had a great time. Not just Waz.
Though Waz had a really good
Waz
time.
had a really good time. And that motherfucker was like on like IG live stories the next day at 9. Like, what's up, y'all?
Yeah. I was like, oh, Waz is recovered.
Right. Meanwhile, I had like 2 beers and like a hit of something. And the next day I was like, Jesus Christ, I need to sleep more. Let me see Instagram for a second. Well, I was like, hey, y'all, you know Vince Staples? What the fuck? But it was an incredible show. Anna, Nando, and Waz all killed it. The audience killed it. The video is going to go up for patrons in a couple of days. Patreon.com/TMBS. Subscribe on YouTube if you haven't yet. Spread the word. You know what it is. This weekend, we're doing an illicit history of humanitarian law with Kristen Per Anderson, who is an academic in Canada. If you haven't listened yet, check out the history of, Chris Per Anderson. I'm dyslexic. Check out the Deutsche Bank illicit history with Corey Pine. We're going to take a brief break and we'll be right back with Dr. Maytha Alhassen.
It is very, very disturbing when I hear the millionaire or billionaire word. And I told them to stop it, knock it off. Keep it simple. It needs to be simple. Keep it simple. Infrastructure, no bumps in the road.
You have a wonderful day, bro, and I'll see you again soon.
This is not beanbag.
I have to say that my brain is still in recovery mode from taking in so many high-level important ideas. Have you heard about the SJW nonsense on the... I don't even care about those guys. It really just honestly doesn't matter.
Good morning, Patriots. Good morning, Rebels.
No good, really bad for you.
Hashtag me too.
That's what he said. That's what I said. That's obviously what our position is. I worked for him, yes, I was a politically commissioned officer.
Ask the moms.
MFer, I want more iced tea.
We came out of the Mar-a-Lago summit with very high hopes.
And he is turning over the tables in the swamp.
Get those white guys, get them, get them.
Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now is Dr. Maytha Alhassen. She is a historian, journalist, and poet. And Maytha, how did I do?
You did great.
Awesome.
You didn't trample over my name or give me a new name, so, thumbs up.
So if you know the work of Marissa Barara-Darin, who is like amazing, and everybody should. She's a brilliant lawyer and historian. She wrote a book called The Color of Money. And I've had her on the show like 3 or 4 times. And she's like, she's great. Like it was to the point where not only was I like butchering, it wasn't like just like, okay, it's the first time on, we don't know each other. It was like, I'd spoken to her on the show multiple times before. We'd exchanged plenty of emails. She was a super good, and I would, every single time we would be about to start, I was like, I got it this time. And then I would be like, Mesa Barine, how are you? What did you say?
I should just.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
I need to add the audio pronunciation on my website. That's a good idea. I'll just have that little tab.
That is actually a really good idea. What I try to do, and I think there was some advantage, because what I try to do is if I'm having a guest that I'm going to be concerned about how to pronounce their name, I try to find interviews with them, but you can't trust other Americans. But you were lucky because absolutely. You had an interview, I think it was like on the South African Broadcasting Corporation. And I was like, yeah, I think that is probably going to be the right way.
Well, what's really funny about my name is that Arabs can't even pronounce it because it's not from the region that I'm from, which is predominantly my parents were born in Syria. And that name is a name that really only exists in Qatar and the UAE. So
that's exactly why I have trouble pronouncing it. I mean, if you gave me a more traditional Syrian name, I'd nail it.
I know. Yeah. I know. Just like my grandfather, you would have a hard time pronouncing it.
Exactly. Just like him.
Just like him who spoke no English. Exactly.
Sometimes I actually feel like I barely speak English in a way. Can you tell me, before we wanted to touch on what's been happening in Sudan and Algeria, but before we get there, and we played some Malcolm X talking about Africa in the cold open, you're somebody who's actually done a lot of historical work documenting the connections of Malcolm X as a global political figure. And these are 2 countries he visited. These are 2 countries he visited in really pivotal times. And I think it'll also help illustrate the difference of the kind of orders that are falling between like a 1980s kind of like right-wing, religious-oriented, military authoritarian leader like Omar al-Bashir in Sudan versus the kind of sclerotic remnants of a really proud revolutionary movement in Algeria. So can you talk about Malcolm X and his position relative to these places?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Malcolm visited the region, so Africa and what people call the Middle East. I sometimes call it North East Africa. Mm-hmm. In 1959 and 1964. We hear mostly about his 64 travels because that was kind of like the Disney conversion story, that he went to Mecca and then saw that everybody was praying together. So the alleged story is that he embraces quote unquote traditional Sunni Orthodox Islam and then becomes colorblind or transcends his vision around race that he inherited from the Nation of Islam, and that wasn't actually true. He went to the region in 1959. He visited Sudan, we know for sure. We're not sure about all the countries that he went to, but Sudan we know because he's mentioned it, that he traveled in 1959. He said, quote, "I was impressed the most by the Muslims of Sudan. Their religious piety and hospitality are unmatched anywhere. I really felt in heaven and home there." And he continued to meet Sudanese people in Lebanon and other places he was traveling. And when he wanted a traditionally trained sheikh to come to Harlem to teach some of his remaining congregation, he was adamant about getting a sheikh from Sudan, and that was Ahmed Hussoun, who ended up being the person who buried him when he was assassinated. So he had a deep connection to Sudan in a spiritual, religious sense. And when it came to Algeria, for him, like for Frantz Fanon, who is a post-colonial thinker, was this incredible inspiration for what it looked like to shake off the shackles of colonialism. The French had been there since 1830, and there was a pretty violent war that was raged against the French, but it was such a worldwide event, because it was this little country that brought France to its knees in 1962. So Malcolm was inspired by it when he was even in New York, and he had not visited yet. He ends up meeting an Algerian ambassador in Ghana who made him rethink his understanding of whiteness, because that person looked white to him. But he realized there was a famous speech when he returns home where he says, when people over there say they're white, it's an adjective. But when people in the U.S. say they're white, it means I'm in power, I'm the boss.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So he kind of, sorry, go ahead.
So for him, he had this romanticized vision of this moment where most African countries that were colonized by European countries, France and Britain predominantly, were decolonizing. Egypt in 1952, Sudan in 1956, and like I said, Algeria in 1962, and many more examples. But he thought that this was a moment that they could come together and work in solidarity to support each other against the U.S. and against the treatment of Black Americans in the U.S., which he defined as domestic colonialism.
So and it kind of like, and to me in my frames, I would say it's interesting the way it sort of like materialized as politics. Like instead of like the sort of like metaphysical teachings on the nature of whiteness as like some type of like spiritual sort of like state created literally by like a big-headed mad scientist. It's one of my favorite stories in the world, actually.
The Yaqub,
the Yaqubs. I see a lot of Yaqubs around me. So and then to like the wait, this is actually like a political expression of power that intersects with all these other relationships, and I think that's interesting, right? Because that was, like the takeaway was an opposition to like the idea that somebody, because they had like literally a certain level of like sun exposure or not, couldn't like be in solidarity or like a fellow human. But it wasn't like, oh, we're all like, no, we're all on the same team, it's all good. It was actually just like, no, this is really a sickness, but it's like a political, material sickness instead of like a religious one in a way.
Yeah, and, interesting enough, part of what he writes in his observations that rarely gets quoted is that he saw Islam as a way to get white Americans to be cured from this cancer of racism.
Right.
So he recommended that for them more than he did anybody else, because he was like, this needs to be clearly eradicated. And if I see what I see in front of me happening in terms of people that I would classify as white, and they see me as their brother, how can I shift that perception and the order of power in the U.S.? And for him, he really did try to marry Islam and decolonial Pan-African politics. So some people after his death really only like to carry one sort of thread of his story. And I think it's multiple things that he was interested in doing.
I recommend, I don't recommend religion in general to many people because it would be hypocritical of me because I'm not religious, but I do recommend Islam to Sam Harris, like really strongly. That's something I've advocated for.
What my goal in this interview is to be invited to a future tribunal critiquing Sam Harris.
Tribunal.
So,
yes. Now that you use the word tribunal, it will definitely happen. I'm totally into that. Let's talk about something more exalted, though, than him, but we'll definitely talk about him in the future, particularly as this book comes together. I would love to do that. What's happening in the Sudan right now?
Yeah, so there are a lot of shifts every single day. But at this moment, there was supposed to be a transitional council that was supposed to be military and civilian, but the civilians do not trust the direction that the military has taken it in, and so they've called for an all-out transitional civilian council. So backing up to this, a couple of weeks ago, Omar al-Bashir was ousted by the military. And the military, thinking that was going to repeat the playbook that had happened in most Arab countries, Sudan is Arabized. Mm-hmm. I would call it an African country, but it had been Arabized. They thought that they can win the favor of people by ousting Omar al-Bashir and maintaining the same structure that it had and maintaining the same political elites that had existed and exploited people. And the people don't want that. So the people are savvy enough. We're in a post-2011, post-quote-unquote Arab Spring, or what more people tend to call it, dignity revolutions moment, and people saw that they had to call for more than just the ousting of a leader. They needed an entire uprooting of an unequal social order that had existed prior to the regime that they have a problem with, that has been incredibly corrupt. Same story in Algeria, but they just had two different breaking points. And for Sudanese people, it started out in December 2018. There had been years of protests against this government, even when it was violently repressed and put down. But in December 2018, in the outskirts, a city called Atbara, there were protests against the tripling price of bread and the incredibly long lines for bread, for fuel, limited cash flow, and then it ended up spreading to Khartoum. And that's when there was a little bit more international attention. But they've been consistently on the front lines calling for a uprooting of this regime that came into power in 1989, but the whole military apparatus and for civilian rule.
They see what happened in Egypt and they're like really savvy about it. I just wanted to, that's what you said, but I just wanted to like bumper sticker it. What is the... Yeah, please go ahead.
I just want to go back because I think people either don't know or don't remember the play out of things, which is that the Egyptian Revolution was January 2011, actually pretty soon after. Mubarak, who had ruled for decades, resigned. Well, he was ousted by the military, and then they had general elections, and the Muslim Brotherhood won. And there were some massacres that happened, a pretty large one, in fact. But during this time, people had resisted that regime because they saw it as incompetent. Things weren't changing economically, socially for them. And unfortunately, the Muslim Brotherhood did get elected democratically. And then the military came in and deposed Mohamed Morsi, who was the president and has been ruling ever since. And that's SCC, who was one of the first to call Trump when Trump was elected, congratulating him.
Al-Sisi, very tight with Trump, and also in the past, I don't know currently, but I know had at least received some consulting advice from people around Tony Blair. So this is like that kind of person. Can you talk, and now you could, please start to bridge to Algeria so we can talk about Algeria as well. But I'm really interested in, you talked about the bread price and austerity. What's like the labor union dimension of all this unrest?
First thing I should say is I am not an expert on Sudan or Algeria, and I can point you to so many people who are, but what I have been studying, as you know, because I sent you the book that I worked on that came out in 2012, is social movements, youth involvement, and uprisings across the quote-unquote Middle East, North Africa. So what was happening is that, let's back up a little bit. Sudan was producing oil, but most of that oil came from South Sudan. And that was a big driver of economic stability, even though this government was lining their pockets. But South Sudan, as we know, ended up seceding in 2011. And at that point, the government had really no money to subsist on. And taking the advice of, the notorious IMF, the International Monetary Fund, instead of finding other avenues to produce wealth for the country and distribute resources, they introduced austerity measures. Mm-hmm. And that included removing subsidies that they had for wheat and electricity. So there were protests against this, and people were not watching. There were protests at the same time in 2011 when South Sudan seceded, 2012, 13, and then again more recently 2018 because it got to a breaking point. So I don't know if I answered.
No, that's perfect. That's perfect.
Necessarily, but there is one of the organizations that people are pointing to now is the Sudan Professional Association, which is an umbrella of professionals from different sectors. But it is civil society, tends to be a little, middle class, like doctors, but that's an umbrella. But there's so many other movements and organizing groups that are involved in this movement.
What's happening in Algeria, and maybe also from the movement perspective, but also can you give us a sense too of the difference in terms of the regime in Algeria that's being resisted against versus the one in Sudan?
Yeah, well, I know people, I think, want to make distinct the idea of what kind of parties, what kind of religious or relationships they have to religious institutions. But I think at the end of the day, you see a really similar blueprint, which is what ended up happening after colonialism was shaken off was that there wasn't much transformation of the social order. Mm-hmm. So people who ended up taking positions as political elites were political elites during colonial times, or they were military figures. And I think that's what has gotten people into this cycle of successive regime changes that are sometimes violent, sometimes not violent military coups.
Right.
So with Algeria, Algeria was liberated in 1962, and there was a leader by the name of Ben Bella who was an inspirational figure for the globe, and he was ousted in 1965. So that was a very short term. And then, successive regimes later, there was a civil war from 1990 to 2002, which was long and hard fought. And, there's a lot of history written about the FLN, National Liberation Front, or in French, Front Libération Nationale. And they were the resistance movement against the French, and they continue to be a big power player in Algeria. But the same with Sudan right now. The Algerians who did protest in 2011 because of rising costs for foodstuffs and basics, they're back on the street because what Bouteflika did in 2011 is seeing what happened to his compatriots, the other dictators in the region. He ended up introducing spending into the country. It's an oil-rich country, not wealthy, oil-rich, part of OPEC. So the people were, quote unquote, appeased for a little bit, right? But now, after Bouteflika had announced that he was going to run a 5th term, and after there was already a constitutional amendment introduced that said a president can only run for 2 terms, and that it didn't include anything retroactive, so it meant that Bouteflika could continue to run and run and run. And,
right.
So folks were not having that, and went on the streets in February, and he resigned in early April, and people within that same regime structure tried to continue to be a part of the transitional council, and the people continue to be on the street. I think that's kind of the similarity with what's happening in Algeria and in Sudan. Different economic states. Clear, you could talk about a different relationship to secularity and Islam.
Right.
But I think those things aren't as important as, I'm a multi-causal type of thinker.
Yep.
And I like thinking about all streams and intersections of.
Yeah, you're good for the Sam Harris Tribunal. Yep. You're good.
Not just one meta reason. But I do think that in the West, because we are not educated in the history of these places, we don't understand the lasting effects of what colonialism did. And there was a completely different colonial structure in Algeria than in Sudan, because Sudan was kind of ruled by Britain and Egypt. So there's so many different layers of what was happening there. But yeah.
Well, that's interesting because I want to get to like the kind of big takeaway, and we'll definitely have more conversations. But I think that that's just interesting though, just time wise. Like I'll draw like a big, broad global connection because that's what I do without attention to specifics. It's part of my job. No, I'm just playing. But Milton Alamati, who we have on this show a lot, who is an amazing Ugandan journalist and a guy who specializes in like Western Africa and Great Lakes region. And we did an illicit history of Thomas Sankara together for patrons, which is amazing. People should definitely check that out. He did say like, there is this like emergent energy. Like a couple years ago, there was something that they called the African Awakening, right? Like, and that was kind of like less defined, but it was also just sort of like pointing to like that, okay, there's the liberation generation, but then colonialism gets reconstituted because the economic relationships don't really change, and all these institutions like the World Bank and IMF and foreign capital come in, and then there's the political failings of all of these governments internally, and now there's like this new wave of activism that wants to sort of like have the next wave of liberation, basically. And I'm just wondering, like, do you think like that would be a more helpful frame? Like, if there was going to be, granted, people just need to be much less simplistic in general. But if people were at least able to start looking at like protests in Sudan as an example, and instead of just kind of slotting it as like, oh, well, there's just like another random protest happening in another random place with another random bad leader, they started to see, no, this is a sort of constituting of a new political energy, of rising generations of people that have, in some ways, actually, in certain ways, maybe economic demands and senses of objections to austerity that aren't, at the very least, they're not alien to things happening in the West. And there's a huge amount of political innovation and energy there that we could all draw from.
Absolutely. I think that what we could see this as well, a really explicit refusal to accept neoliberal economic policies, which is what they're suffering from, like the IMF coming in, introducing austerity measures, and also right-wing wealthy countries trying to support Sudan there's a whole messy history of Sudan, Omar Bashir sending Sudanese people to fight in Yemen because of the support he was getting from Saudi Arabia. Mm-hmm. So there's a refusal to be part of that that devastating violence as well, because that involvement is also unpopular in Sudan. So then there's also this refusal to continue structures of colonial domination, which, in the U.S., we don't think about colonial structures that we maintain from our settler colonial project at all. But they're recognizing what those are. And I think another takeaway is that they do see these, they do see that the military is not the solution, which is a big shift from the 2011 moment, and that civilian rule, most of the signs that you see, which there's tons of signs, chants, and art in Algeria and Sudan as part of protest culture, do say freedom, peace, and justice. Mm. Even as they are being tear gassed, hit with rubber bullets, killed on the streets, and being brutalized in hospitals, they know that civilian rule cannot come by violence. And I think that's different than the way that we romanticized armed struggle in the decolonial moment or decolonizing moment. And, I adore Malcolm, and I would never tell anybody what their struggle should look like, but there was a romanticizing of armed violence as being the only way to shake off colonialism. But we're in a different moment.
Yeah, we're definitely, even just for super practical reasons, we're in a very different moment. Maytha Alhassen, Dr. Maytha Alhassen, she's a historian, she's a poet, she's an activist. You can find her at the Young Turks. You can find her at your college campus. You have a link to all the ways that you can find her work. It's really, really important, really fascinating stuff. And well communicated in a way where all this complex stuff is actually very accessible, which is very rare. If you're in this game, you know that's really rare. So I really appreciate your time.
Thank you for letting me talk for 90% of the time.
That's your job. And also well done, because I don't usually let that happen, according to the feedback that I get.
I do hear background chatter. I think I need to be in the studio to see people's faces.
You definitely need to be in the studio. Well, when you visit New York, you'll come in the studio, of course. Well, you'll be in the studio for the Sam Harris Tribunal.
Yes. Oh my God, please. Can we also have, what are they called? Little mantles? Like the judge things. I'm so sorry,
gavels. But actually, Matt, can I get a little call to prayer? Maybe we could play some.
Oh my God! I can totally do an adhan for Sam Harris.
Yes, I want to really Muslim this up. I want to throw a lot of bad ideas at that guy.
Oh yeah.
I'm the mother load of bad ideas. All right, Maytha, I really appreciate your time. We'll talk to you soon. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
Take care. All right, guys, here's what we're going to do. We have a segment to get to, and that is David Griscom. Look at him. Hey, David, do you want to start doing economic update segments at the live show?
I could do that.
I've been amazed that you haven't asked, actually, to be honest with you. Well, he said, I could do that. I can pretend that I...
Don't you think it would start things off really hot if we did a financial news?
Just read the ticker for 30 minutes?
Yeah. Matt, do you ever want to bring back the Regulate segment? Or do you want to find a new segment for yourself?
I thought about doing a segment called Steven Crowder Can't Dunk. Maybe we'll test that out in the post game.
Maybe something weed related.
No, not this time.
Okay, all right. Steven Crowder can't. I'm just thinking maybe you might want to broaden the parameters of it. You don't want to actually talk about Steve Crowder every single week.
No, I think I do.
Okay. All right, to each their own. David Griscom, Richard Wolff isn't here, so you're free to go.
Hell yeah.
Did you watch his review of your work that we posted on YouTube?
Of course, I was there. It was good.
But how was it in the reenact? How was it like watching it on screen while he sort of methodically dissected you?
I was prepared for it. And as I always say, bring it again, Wolfman.
I was about to say
we're gonna go for a round 3 on
I was
this.
about to say you took it as like a man, but not very mature. All right, David, go ahead. What's up?
Yeah, I just wanted to talk about some of this really great news that happened over the last week. The Stop and Shop strikes, successful now, we can say, Stop and Shop strikes across the Northeast. And these are really significant. I mean, we're talking about one of the largest private sector strikes that we've seen in years. Around 31,000 workers went on strike, 240 stores. And Stop and Shop, especially in that area, very much runs the grocery game. As we've seen more and more, these kind of crucial services to the community are being controlled more and more by smaller groups. And, Stop and Shop is controlled by a Dutch company, Ahold Delhaize, which last year made $2 billion in profits. So this year they came forward with a new plan that basically very sneakily cut benefits for workers. They made it seem like people were getting a raise, but in fact, because of the major changes to their health plan and because of changes to the way that people are getting paid. So currently people get paid extra for working on holidays and on Sundays. And especially those Sunday hours are very important for a lot of workers who, if you're a working class person, you budget your time and you know what shifts that you need to get to make your end goal at the end of the month. Anyways, they were going to cut those. And I mean, we're talking about pretty significant changes to people's health plan. One worker who was interviewed on Jacobin magazine, they saw their monthly payment to their health plan was going to go up from $20 a month to $100 a month. Their premium, which was $700 a year for them and their partner, was going to be going up to $1,500 a year. And some people saw even higher increases. So this is a very significant move. And again, this is something we should really talk about a lot more. This is where we see that corporations are able to control people's lives in an outsized way by controlling their access to healthcare, because that's a significant right and an important thing that people need to be able to access, and to have it be so arbitrarily controlled by others is wrong. So anyways, 31,000 workers went on strike, and the community came out in full support for these people. People were showing up with food for them. And this is a really important thing. The strike fund, which basically allows people to continue getting access to money during the strike, got over 1,000 donations just from the community itself. So that's huge. And they were able to win their demands and to maintain the rights and the privileges that they fought for years. It's an absolutely significant thing. It's very exciting to see. And we see, again, when you strike, you win. Now, I wanted to juxtapose this, though, to something that just happened yesterday. The Department of Labor released an opinion letter, which is one of the stronger rulings that it can give out, that allowed an undisclosed company, usually they're undisclosed when they have when they make these rules, that the company has people who basically are using an app platform who clean people's homes. So we don't know what company it is, but we could imagine it's something like a Handy. And let's not forget that Handy, we've talked about before, has been lobbying the equivalent of the Department of Labor on the state level for the past year and a half. Anyway, the Department of Labor said that they can now treat these people, these gig workers, as contract employees, which mean independent contractors, which means that they don't have to pay in Social Security, that they don't have to pay attention to the minimum wage laws, that basically all the workers' protections that we fought so hard over, since the beginning of this country, they just start to disappear. And you see how there's always this dance of deregulation that's going on, especially when, you're able to come up with new and creative ways to categorize workers. Now, I'm bringing this up in the context of the Stop and Shop movement because Stop and Shop owners said that it's really difficult for them to compete in a market where other grocery stores are not unionized. And we see this kind of competition between unionized and unionized labor. And what's happening more and more as, one, union density has dropped, and two, corporations are coming up with clever ways to avoid having to give their workers protections and also to atomize them so that people aren't going to the same workplace. They don't know each other. They don't have that same kind of solidarity. They can now pay people less, and there's less likely possibilities of people going on strike. So what we're seeing now, just like Stop and Shop, though, the concentration of labor in this country is becoming tighter and tighter. We have a few companies, Amazon, Walmart, Stop and Shop, that control important aspects to our daily life. The workers who maintain those systems are so crucial to capitalism. So being creative, or even just bold, like they were in the Stop and Shop case, has such a massive effect because, you know, people have to get their groceries. They have to eat. They have to have access to food. People need access to all the other things and all these other services that are provided by these major corporations. So being creative in the ways that we're able to hit these sort of nodal points of the system actually has a lot of opportunity. So when we're seeing more and more of these new categorizations in the labor market, we should be thinking to ourselves also about the opportunity that we have with more and more monopoly power to really hit these centers as hard as we can.
That was why Marx was interested in labor in a lot. I mean, that was the prime area where there was a counter force of actual power.
Absolutely.
In the sense that you could literally disrupt capitalism through withdrawing your labor. That's an enormously powerful move. I'll just say I took a car back from the airport. Like a proper car. Like the dude just asked me if I wanted to like take a black car, and he was a nice guy, so I was like, sure, whatever. And listening to this man talk about what Uber has done to his livelihood is one of the most disgusting things I've ever heard in my life. I mean, down to the point of like a 3-hour trip that he got paid, I think $75 or $100 for, if I remember correctly.
God.
And that's on his car, paying his toll, like, it's obscene. And like with all of these things, the price is inevitably going to come back at you. Like when all of these other places are totally wiped out and there's no competition and government is owned by whatever the special interest is, you don't think that you're going to see that in your prices, even if you're making like short-term tactical decisions?
Yeah, I mean, especially in the case of Uber and Lyft, when they're pretty much, you know, they're funding every ride so that they can crowd out everybody, and they're breaking the law.
They're breaking the law all the time
to beat out all their competition.
Definitely.
And that's, you know, what they try to do on the national level too, with categorizing workers as, you know, gig workers or whatever, instead of what they actually are, which is employees of a major corporation.
Absolutely. All right, guys, we're going to take a brief break, and we're going to come back with the great Anna Kasparian on the Michael Brooks Show. Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now in studio is the iconic Anna Kasparian from the Young Turks.
Hey.
Anna, thanks for being here.
It's so great to be here.
What do you think of New York?
I like it. New York wakes me up a little bit.
Right.
I think I'm very used to the routine and the laid-back nature of LA. Every time I come here, I feel like I'm not doing enough. I need to work harder. And I need that. I need that motivation.
Do you really need that? I feel like you're pretty on it. I don't know, like I feel fairly on it, and when I was in LA, I kind of appreciated it. It's like, no, man, just have a lemon. It's cool.
I'm still. It's so funny. One avocado, maybe a handful of almonds.
Yeah.
No.
I'm like, yes, I do. Thank you.
Sometimes I feel a little checked out. Like I'm still working and I'm still functioning. But I think if I were living in a place that's as fast paced as New York, maybe I would open my mind to some different opportunities.
Some new ideas.
Some new projects, some new ideas.
Ideas?
Yeah. That's all I want to do. I just want to focus on ideas.
We just have to get this out of the way because we know, like, look, we're going to talk about this Lula interview. We're going to talk about Pete Buttigieg and why. I mean, he's absolutely my least favorite person running for president in the Democratic side. I don't know. Who is yours, by the way? Who do you hate the most?
Who do I hate the most?
There's a lot of options, I know, but
yeah,
mine's Buttigieg.
I don't hate anyone, but I do dislike Buttigieg. I think he'd probably he's not number one. I don't know if I want to disclose it. I don't know if I'm undecided at the moment.
Oh, all right.
Look, I gotta be real. Okay, fine. I'm gonna keep it real.
No, it's all right. It's cool. You don't have to keep it real.
I don't like being barred from interviews.
Oh.
So. But with that said, I can't say that I hate her.
Right.
I don't hate her. I think that what she did was just beyond problematic, especially given, what occurred with Donna Brazile and Hillary Clinton, just some of the manipulation behind the scenes. That's not cool. If you're a progressive, you need to be open to challenging questions, especially from someone who actually is open-minded toward you. But anyway, that's a completely different
If you're
story.
going to be progressive, you should be progressive, like in a steady way. Like you should be super progressive.
Especially because you have some ideas. I actually didn't mean to use the word ideas there in reference to Dave. But she has important things to say when it comes to U.S. intervention and regime change and all those things. By the way, for anyone who's wondering what the hell I'm talking about.
You're talking about Christian Gillibrand. Well, actually, that's a good contrast. Christian Gillibrand has absolutely no interesting ideas about U.S. foreign policy. So there you go.
True. Yeah. But yeah, Tulsi Gabbard, she has important things to say, and it would have been, I wish things would have gone down differently, but it is what it is.
It is what it is. No, that was incredibly whack of her. And, I get that some people relate to her in like a super intense way. And I don't know. I guess I relate to Lula in an intense way, but he's a political prisoner who brought 40 million people out of poverty. Like, I feel like anybody's running for president, including the ones I really like.
Right.
You got to be in a position to constructively criticize them. And I think, like, what's funny to me about, I'll just say this about Dulcie, and I'm not really, because I think, again, at this point, I've definitely given her due. And not only have you given her, I feel like the first time we talked, I was the one going at her, and you were more like, wait a second, like there's actually some really good stuff here in this record, which is true, right?
Yeah,
like
definitely.
You're 100% right. So I like what she said about Venezuela. I like the video she put out about Ilhan Omar. But on the flip side, like there is a very strong belief amongst the people who are seriously fanatically devoted to her that like, and by the way, there are people fanatically devoted against her too.
Yes.
That is true.
Yep.
But like they think like, oh, she's at 1% in the polls, but like everybody who sees her is going to have the same reaction to her that you have to her, not you, like you. And that's just that's almost never true of anybody. So the concerns that you were raising are the concerns that she would need to seriously answer if she was going to build like a left primary lane.
Yeah, exactly. And what would have been powerful if we had that conversation, I was part of that interview, and she just told the truth, right? Or because here's the fact of the matter. We all change. We all grow. We change our positions. And so, if she looked me in the eye and said, I absolutely 100% do not agree with torture, my previous comments on torture were misguided, whatever it is, I would have so much respect for that kind of answer 100%. And that kind of self-realization. So it is what it is. But I don't know if I would say that she's the one I dislike the most. I just think that there are a number of candidates right now who are running with this progressive label when they clearly are not progressive.
They're not progressive.
And Buttigieg certainly falls under that category.
Oh yeah, Buttigieg. I mean, I have no substance or reason behind it other than he really fucking annoys me. But we'll get to that. But first, Dave Rubin, Dave, if you're watching this, stop fucking impersonating me, impersonating you. It's enough. And people who see this will know what I'm talking about. He was on a British show. I don't know the name of the British show. I don't know how important it is. What's No Filter? Wait.
No Filter is my
No
show.
Filter is Anna's show.
I think he was on Sky News, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, well, Sky News is trying to be like the British Fox. And so he was on this show with this British guy. And I'm sorry, I should, whatever. That's the amount of this British guy with the blue shirt. And Dave...
That guy kind of looks like he could be Cenk's brother.
You're not progressive, are you?
so of course, in a British accent.
Of course, Dave Rubin's a moron. So Dave finally, and I would speculate that Dave maybe has heard this stuff before. I'd also would say that this is all opinion, Dave. All opinion. Everything is opinion. I'll keep saying that because I think Dave has his mind on some things. I think Dave's like, we could be leaving things on the table. There's a lot of studio equipment at these places. This is him watching you tell what, in my opinion, is the truth about him.
Right.
And his reaction. And now...
I'm going to go ahead and say it's not an opinion, it's fact. And if he wants to come at me with any type of lawsuit, please do so.
Yeah.
No, I'm just saying because...
And name the Young Turks.
You know I have receipts, homeboy.
Yes.
You know it.
Oh.
And look, before we get to the video...
delicious, yes.
Before we get to the video, let me just say, I also have some, self-awareness. I hate the way I sound in this video.
Aww.
It's genuine and, the passion in which I make my case is
real. Yes.
But with that said, I sound unbearable.
I don't agree. I think you sound clear and concise talking about an unbearable person. But regardless, and no offense to you, Anna, but the real takeaway of this clip is his facial reactions. That's what we're watching for. Go ahead.
Can I please finally tell the truth about why he left the Young Turks? He wanted to make a 6-figure salary to host a 30-minute-a-week show when everyone here, because we work for an independent news company, was getting paid far less while working 12-hour days. That's why Dave Rubin left the company. And now all of a sudden he's getting funded by the Koch brothers, and all of a sudden his opinions are very different. He has no political identity. He is not an honest actor. He is not an intellectual. He is a fraud. That's who Dave Rubin is.
I wish I knew how she really felt. Boy, that's...
God. I'm sorry, pause it. Is there ever a time where he doesn't go to not only the hack line, but the hack line that the hack would be like, all right, that's a hack line. Like, ever. This motherfucker goes there. Always. All right, please finish.
How she really felt. Boy, that's...
But no, quite where to begin. Fraud, lazy, avaricious, immoral, you wanted more money.
First off, I never asked for... it's so silly to even, unfortunately, to have to talk about these little nonsensical things. Because I like talking about ideas, not about people. I never asked for more money. That's number one. I left. I told them...
I can't believe... He must not watch The Critics, right? Because... if someone calls me out, rightfully so, for using some lame, tired argument, then I would be hyper aware of it and I wouldn't use that argument anymore. But he's still doing it. He's still saying ideas. I just want to talk about ideas. What are your ideas? I want to know what his ideas are. I haven't heard a single idea from him.
Well, my idea is that we should talk about ideas.
The main one is that Muslims are destroying Europe.
Well, Muslims are really bad, but there's also other things that we could talk about too.
That's number one. I left. I told them I was leaving and I left. There were no negotiations. That's it. Actually, my executive producer, who I brought with me, they offered to double his salary if he stayed. So together we would have made more money if we'd stayed. But that has nothing to do with nothing.
Does it make you angry?
I would say no. It's like it's kind of pathetic, really. I'm not funded by the Koch brothers. I mean, I wish I was funded by the Koch brothers. That would be nice. I wouldn't be wearing H&M underwear. I mean, it's like this is what I'm talking about. It's that sort of endless hysteria, attacking people, attacking motives. Nobody's interested in that anymore. I really don't think people are interested in that.
I think people are super interested in the hysteria and the conflict. But let me just say, he is telling the truth about one thing, and his husband is his producer.
Okay.
And he was really good at what he did. And so when Dave Rubin wanted to leave, we wanted to keep his husband because he was good at production. And so I don't know for sure if they offered to double his salary, but I know that he was offered a raise. And Dave Rubin was so insulted by that because the company was basically like, yeah, you can go, Rubin, but we want to keep your husband and we'll pay him more. And mind you, this entire time, Rubin's like lobbying them to pay him more, pay me more. I'm going to do this really lame 30-minute a week show on like social stuff.
It's like the Daily Show, except it's not funny. And it's also like Talk Soup, except it's not the 1990s. Double my salary.
Jeez. And there's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with leaving to go make more money.
Definitely.
One of our great producers actually got offered to go work somewhere else and make more money. She left. Good for you. We're not hating on you for that. But my attack toward him was because for 2 years straight, he was bad-mouthing us over and over and over again. And I'm like, I can't take it anymore. I have to say something. How did that
work? I mean, he built his whole brand on trashing you guys for years. And then was it just like, I mean, I get it. Like it's like in much smaller, like you can't respond to everything, obviously. So was it just like a conscious decision to like just be the better people?
So...
Or was it because of your lack of interest in ideas?
Honestly, at first, as I've talked about before, I was hurt more than anything because we were friends. And so it was weird that he left on good terms. We're still friends. We're still hanging out. And then out of nowhere, he goes on Rogan's show. And I think that was the very first time he publicly attacked us. And he never named me. He would just say the Young Turks, or he would specifically target Cenk. And so I remember texting him and saying, what are you doing? Why are you doing? We're friends. Why are you doing this? And why are you making things up about us? He's like, well, I'm not talking about you. I'm just, I'm talking about Cenk and TYT.
Oh, see, he didn't have his line yet.
Yeah.
You should have said I'm talking about.
I'm just talking about my ideas.
About my ideas.
TYT.
Yeah. I have a lot of ideas about TYT.
And the thing is, like, I'm kind of half the face of TYT.
Right. I mean, that is a pretty incredible, like, you are literally on the fucking Twitter account, right? Like, isn't it like a photo of you and Cenk?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's like a pretty outwardly facing part of the whole brand.
Yeah, exactly. So, and then look, after watching that video the first time, I enjoyed it. And then I felt bad. I felt bad because you can see the hurt in his face. You can see like it was like a gut punch, and I felt guilty. And I said, you know what? I've said my piece, and I don't need to go at it anymore. But you keep reeling me in, Michael.
I know.
You keep reeling me in.
Godfather 3 it every time. It's too funny. He's also just, I mean, it's not just that he's a piece of shit, and we're gonna look at this for a second, but it's also that he's like a conduit for so like. And I don't know why, because to be honest, like I didn't really watch him when he was on TYT.
Because he was terrible.
Because he was terrible, and also, it was just like, yeah, I just don't catch everything, right? And it wasn't like I ever saw a panel and thought like, Dave made a good point. So that's true. But then I noticed that was like this guy, first it was like he was building his whole brand on like, I'll be the dumb guy that Sam Harris can whine about being mistreated with. And of course, that immediately, I'm like, because I am like Sam Harris. Nope, don't buy that bullshit. Totally toxic figure in our culture, period. But then then I noticed, I was like, wait a second, like this whole brand is going to be built on like trashing a place. Now, look, no doubt, if you offered me, there is a number that I could go on. I could be like, look, Sam sucks, and let me break it down. But I would do a good job at breaking it down.
Mm-hmm.
I would have my brief mastered. So I think there was also just something so fundamentally offensive about it. Was like, you're doing but you're still just bad.
Yeah, I
Like,
mean,
where's the hustle?
there's got to be a little bit of work in
Right.
your grifting, right?
Right.
Because it's just, even if you don't believe in what you're saying, right? Like, you should care about the way you appear. And if I wanted to be a grifter, I want to at least seem smart about it.
And you know what the thing with him is, I don't even think, and this is not, again, this literally is all speculation. I feel like it's almost like pre-belief or not belief. Like he's super dim. All right, this is the, what I'm trying to say is, not a bright guy.
Well, he says
They're very ironic that this guy would do race and IQ platforming. That's all I'll say. Extremely ironic. All right. What's this info, Matt?
So Dave has
and
been
then we'll move on to
becoming
bigger
more
and
and more bold about saying that he's not funded by the Koch brothers, but he is funded by Koch brother think tanks.
Yeah.
Including on February 27th, they announced a new partnership. Exciting news. ARI, that's the Ayn Rand Institute, has partnered with Dave Rubin for a special series of the Rubin Report titled Objectivism on Happiness. Now, not only is Ayn Rand funded by right-wing billionaires, but literally the Koch brothers. If you look at, I think this is, I forget what this website is called, but it's sort of like Wikipedia.
Is that SourceWatch?
Yeah, it might be SourceWatch. So you get grants from the Charles Koch Foundation, $42K in 2014, only $4,800 in 2015, but also receives funding from Donors Capital Fund, which is a much more darker money group that the Koch brothers hide behind.
If I got money directly from them, I could have Uniqlo underwear.
So I guess that's the question, Dave, is how much money do you get from think tanks connected to the Koch brothers?
Yeah, I don't know. We're just ideas. Jesus Christ. Well, I can't.
My brain is still in recovery mode from taking in so many high-level important ideas.
Oh my God. Oh my God.
Hit us again. Come on, go.
I have to say that my brain is still in recovery mode from taking in so many high-level important ideas.
When did he say that? Was that recent?
That was
high-level important idea.
It was within the last year, and it was referring to a live event he did with the Brett and Eric Weinstein.
High-level important ideas like Peter Thiel good, college kids being mean to me bad.
By the way, check out Timba on Toast, TIMBAH on toast, because he did a 3-part series where I stole that drop from. So,
all right, to close it one more time, please.
I have to say that my brain is still in recovery mode from taking in so many high-level important ideas.
It makes me like a fucking child.
Ideas are my cocaine.
Wait, you're turning it into like an early 90s backpack rap? Like, ideas of my cocaine.
Unbelievable.
Care about those guys, it really just honestly doesn't matter.
It matters. It matters a lot. He knows it.
Oh my God. All right. Let's talk about the complete opposite of Dave. Let's talk about Lula a little bit. So I follow this case very regularly. What is your impression of it? I'm curious.
Are you talking about the corruption case?
Yeah, just Lula in general.
Yeah.
Because I know, like, I obviously have hustled on it a lot, and I'm curious the feedback.
Yeah. Well, so
Yeah.
you're my friend,
Yes.
and so I try to be aware of whether or not I'm being biased or influenced by people around me. So
Right.
I really tried to dig into, the corruption charges and all that. And I have to be honest with you, it sounds like a bunch of bullshit. It really does. I mean, it all hinged on one individual who was given, a plea deal to say all sorts of things about Lula and his corruption. And what I know, and I mean, obviously not to the same extent as someone like Lula, but what I've experienced personally and what I've seen in America when it comes to people who want to fight for the working class and who want reforms and revolution, the way that they're treated by the mainstream media, the way that they're smeared, the way that they're attacked is very real. And those in positions of power will use their power to just smash any individual that they disagree with or any individual that puts their position of power in jeopardy, right? And we saw it to some extent with Ilhan Omar.
Definitely.
Right? And
definitely.
And so I just know that whenever it comes to someone who's looking out for the working class, they are always a target. And it doesn't matter how popular they are. If corporations or people with any power want to go after them, they can and they will. And that's the risk that you take. And what I thought was so powerful about Lula was he's still willing to fight, knowing that he's put himself in a huge disadvantage by doing so.
Yeah, I mean, and I always make the point too that, like, look, I think that in a position, again, it's sort of like, I mean, it's very different than Venezuela, but like the truth of the matter is the man is in prison and he was barred for running for an election, which I think he definitely would have won. He was leading by double digits in the polls. He's still just a good politician, right? Like just even on that level. If he was still in government, if the Workers' Party was still in government, if the social movements in Brazil were saying like, no, we need to have like a little bit more critique, then that's one thing, right? But we're in a really extreme situation where democracy's been reversed there, where he is a political prisoner. And also I would say, and this is where I'm transparent, like I am shocked that the amount of resources they've put into building a case, this is all they have. Like it blows my mind. And my position would definitely be, I'm totally transparent about this, that like if they found some relatively low-level corruption, which also has to do with like how Brazil is run, I would still 100% support Lula, right? Like, so the first major scandal that he was embroiled in when he was still president, which he survived, was his party was paying off smaller parties to vote. And ironically, voting on things like increasing the minimum wage and all of these types of things, right? But that's how politics works there.
Right.
And what I think is incredible is that there are people who in the United States would be like the first ones to say like, you can't criticize Joe Biden for going to, do a fundraiser with a Comcast lobbyist. Like, that's how campaigns are run. And not everybody can be Bernie Sanders, and you should be an adult. Then they go to a context which is even more like brass knuckle, hard to deal with, literal, like, okay, give me a fucking duffel bag, set up a party for me. Like, that's how it works. And people come into power, they navigate that system, they deliver huge things for real people. And at the time, they're praised for becoming pragmatic. That was like when Lula first came to power, it was all like, oh my God, look at him. He was a radical, but now he knows how to work the system. Well, that's what working the system means.
Right.
Like it means that you cut deals. It means that you make peace with power. It's just that they made peace with power in a way that, as I always say, lifted 40 million people out of poverty. I don't know how much that can be underscored.
Right, exactly. So it is amazing because I remember when we did a story on Brazil and specifically what happened to Lula on the Young Turks, there were a number of our viewers who tend to make excuses for corruption here in the United States, arguing vehemently against what Lula allegedly did, right? And it was just amazing to me because, I mean, look, if you are okay with the type of corruption that we have here in the United States, and this corruption hurts the working and middle class, I mean, we've talked about it over and over again. If you're okay with that, then you have absolutely no leg to stand on when it comes to how politics works in a different country. Now, you could make an argument if there is real evidence other than one person's testimony that Lula, did something horrible and corrupt. But had he done something horrible and corrupt to benefit himself, rather than these tens of millions of people, then maybe you have an argument there. But that's not what happened.
That's not what the evidence is. And
Right.
The evidence is like how money, and money was funneled to campaigns. And that's how things work. And also, right, like, and what they have him on is like a middle-class condo. Like
I know,
literally,
I
like
know.
that's also what's incredible about it is like, you look at the footage and you're like, okay, like that definitely looks like something. I mean, meanwhile, again, Obama, Clinton, they're going and giving these massive, speeches at Goldman.
Right.
They're partying with Richard Branson. Tony Blair is literally advising a Kazakh dictator on how to spin a massacre. And that's all legal. So we need to like redefine our anti-corruption conversation.
Absolutely. One question that I've had, and you would probably know the answer to this, we get a very skewed image or view of what the Brazilian people think about Lula. And I'm curious, following his arrest and his imprisonment, what was the majority public opinion? Was there any type of uprising in Brazil in response to it?
Well, I mean, it's really contradictory, right? Because it's like, on one hand, I think the polling was split, almost like 50-50 on whether or not he should go to jail.
Mm-hmm.
But then he, again, had like a significant lead in the presidential race. And there was also a recent poll that came out that showed that like a I cannot pronounce that
plurality.
word. Plurality thought that he was the best president that Brazil had ever had.
Mm-hmm.
I think, though, like, first of all, there's a segment of voters in Brazil that are like literally, I mean, they are Lula to Bolsonaro voters, which is bizarre, but that's like the Bernie to Trump, right? Like that exists there too. And I think also if what people need to prepare for and think about, it will be different here, of course. But as you were saying earlier, I mean, look, if Bernie Sanders becomes president, there is going to be a unremittent war against him from every single faction of institutional power in this country. And so you had, yes, the economy slowed down under Dilma, whatever, but like you had a turning point in like 2014, 2015, maybe even earlier, where the entirety of the press, the entirety of the establishment went to war against him every single day without any type of broad alternative messaging. So yeah, that's going to have a real impact. That's going to take you from leaving office. I think he left office like 85% approval rating to down to like late 40s, upper 40s, early 50s. I think he's ticking up a little bit again because of how he's handled this, which is mind blowing.
It is mind blowing
to voluntarily be like, all right.
The strength of Lula is amazing. But just going back to what you said about Bernie Sanders, if he wins the nomination, I think you're absolutely right. And I think we're already seeing the mainstream media and its tactics. For instance, the type of questions that Bernie Sanders gets, I have no issue with them per se, but they're obviously very different from the types of questions that other candidates get. So, the last town hall that he did, there was a woman who asked him about Soviet Russia and, just completely mistaking Soviet Russia and communism with some of the socialist programs that Bernie Sanders is pushing for. And that's not an accident. I don't think it's an accident. I mean, he keeps getting those types of questions. The question about allowing prisoners to vote, that was an interesting question to put into the mix, right? And I think that unfortunately did hurt him a little bit in the polls, but whether or not it's going to destroy his chances, I don't know. All I know is they're chipping away, and there needs to be a concerted effort with progressive media to fight back. And right now we're a little fragmented, I think. Yeah. Right? So we need to find a way to kind of get together, maybe create some sort of consortium where we have like a rapid response as soon as...
Definitely.
As you know what I mean? Like all hands on deck, we all have our platforms and we all fight together. And there's so many great progressive voices out there. I think that we can do it.
No, I agree with you completely. Let's play a little bit of this Lula B-roll and I'll read some of this statement and then we'll go to Biden and Buttigieg, the absolute opposites. But yeah, so he was allowed to give his first press interview. He's been held in solitary confinement. He's been barred from giving like video interviews. And again, this is a country where like heads of cartels and people who've convicted on like mass murder charges do like general interest interviews. This is the first time the Supreme Court asserted he could speak. They actually tried to stop it for a second. That's Lula. I know he's in his 70s, but I don't think I would look like that after a year in solitary confinement with a suit.
Yeah,
just like, yeah, whatever.
He's on fire.
Alguém acha que os Estados Unidos vai favorecer o Brasil? Americano, pense americano em primeiro lugar, pense americano em segundo lugar, pense americano em terceiro lugar.
Oh, this is the part where I actually know this part. He said, why is Bolsonaro saluting an American flag? You're supposed to love your mother and your country.
Get
and
their asses.
He said America, what did you say?
And then he's like, I'm
gonna get their
I
ass.
said get their ass.
Well, he did say that because one of the main takeaways in the interview, there's a couple of highlights. One is he said Brazil's run by lunatics, and the Brazilian elite need to ask themselves how they allowed this to happen. He said America thinks of itself first, second, third, fourth, and fifth.
Yep.
So why should Brazil be thinking of America and trying to appease them? And it's like emasculating, basically. Then he said, and just not dignified, he said, in the region and the poverty he's from, this is, look, he's like laughing. He's like, if I didn't die before I was 5, you don't bow down to anybody. He said he has a feeling he's going to live to 120. So
I believe
looking
him.
forward.
Him.
He will, and he's not. And his sentence has been reduced, and there's talk that he might get put into house arrest in the fall if he pays a fine. And as of now, he's saying like, I am not going to acknowledge wrongdoing. I'm going to leave the prison with my head held as high as I did when I got in here. And
I believe him. I mean,
yeah.
He beat throat cancer.
He beat throat cancer.
That's insane.
He lost 2 fingers. God. And this is a couple of weeks, like after, like within 2 years, his wife has died, his brother has died, his grandson has died. And he just said, I mean, this is a translation, I'll just briefly from Brazil Wire. I can't read all of it, but they sent this to me. He said, we created PT in 1980 to demand democratic freedoms, the rights of people and workers, the accumulation of the struggles of the PT and the Brazilian left, and the syndicalism of social and popular movements led us to consolidate a democratic pact in 1980 Constitution. This pact was broken by the impeachment coup in 2016 and its unfolding, which was my condemnation without guilt and my arrest in record time so that I could not run for election. I reaffirm my innocence, proven by all means of proof in actions that I was unjustly condemned by Judge Sergio Moro. And he goes on and he says, most importantly, I know the injustices against me rests on the Brazilian people who have lost their rights, opportunities, fair wages, formal employment, income, and hope for a better future. Today, I'm here to talk to journalists, as I've done throughout my life. In fact, I talked to our people. This right was denied to me for 7 months, and during the electoral process, I was absolutely outlawed. But I keep certainty with me, prisoner or free, censored or not. I have with the Brazilian people an eternal communion that time will not erase. Against all powerful, against censorship and oppression, we will always be together for a better Brazil, more just, with opportunities for all. Thank you. And then he also said, he's like, a lot of people saw this coming, and I could have gone into exile, but I'm committed to Brazil. So that's him doing his thing.
He's a leader.
He is
That's
a leader.
what leaders do. Leaders fight knowing that it's either unpopular to push for the policies that they're pushing for. And in this case, obviously, his policies were popular. But more importantly, you keep fighting regardless of the attacks and the intimidation. And I mean, he's resilient. He's been in solitary confinement and he's, coming out, fighting like this, resilient. He's not giving up. It's pretty amazing.
It's unbelievable. It's mind blowing.
Yeah.
And I know, I don't know if it's been released yet, but I know some other people that I have connections with are going to be interviewing him in the next 10 days. So he's going to be continuing to do his thing. But it's just amazing to, like, it's one thing that he's pissed. It's another that he still kind of has like his good cheer.
Mm-hmm.
That's like mind blowing to me.
Yeah,
he's still
for
like,
sure.
yeah, like, all right, like, sure, I'm in prison, but basically I'm still president. Let's do this.
Yeah. I love it. I love it.
That's fucking awesome.
Can I make a quick comment
Yeah,
about
please.
Venezuela?
Go.
So, look, obviously, our foreign policy is always based on self-interest, and it's super short-sighted. But while Trump pushes, and the Trump administration pushes for regime change in Venezuela, remember that it's also simultaneously trying to convince Kim Jong-un to give up, nuclear programs and his weapons.
Right.
Here's the thing, though. If you are pushing for regime change and you show what America is really all about, why would someone like Kim Jong-un want to give up, his missile tests, his nuclear weapons development? Why would he, right? Because
Totally.
The United States over and over again has shown itself to be a bully, especially when there are resources at play, especially when there's something to gain off of regime change. I mean, you just have to think about it as rational actors. Kim Jong-un might be a crazy person, but at the end of the day, you know, if you look at political theory, he's a rational actor. And a rational actor does not disarm, knowing that there is, you know, this, hegemonic power that's trying to, make decisions about which person leads which country, which regime makes sense for which country. I mean, it's our nation's history. It's how we've always acted. And if we want to, approach countries like North Korea from a more diplomatic perspective, it's really hard to do it when we're trying to do regime change in a different country.
It's insane to simultaneously. You're totally right. And
and all of these politicians, whether they're, whether we have a Democrat in office or a Republican, it's always, this is a difficult problem that I inherited. I don't know what to do. So I'm just going to go ahead and continue the same failed policies that previous administrations carried out.
Yeah.
And it's really frustrating because I feel like nothing is ever going to change as long as we have this corrupt system at play. I mean, look at Eric Prince. He sees a huge business opportunity in Venezuela. John Bolton was super honest about how he was on one of the mainstream media outlets, I forget which, but he was super transparent about the need to access Venezuelan oil.
100%. Totally transparent.
And just on that Eric Prince, because this was a quote that I read this morning that was quite worrying. His head of Director of Investor Relations, Maytha Alhassen, said this morning he does have a solution for Venezuela, just as he has a solution for many other places.
Mm-hmm.
That's great.
That's great. It's amazing that business is even fucking legal. Let's dunk on Buttigieg for a few minutes, and then we're gonna go to the post game. But we just had to play this. This is him with Al Sharpton. I mean, I can't even set this up more. Check this. Like, honestly, has Pete Buttigieg ever hung out with non-white people? And where is this charisma that I keep hearing about?
I mean,
the original Sylvia. Yes, family. This is a granddaughter you just met. What's your name? It's a funny name. I'll give it. All right, come back.
I love Al Sharpton's just like, yeah.
So how's it going?
Not too bad. It's a bit wild. We're having fun.
Did you expect to get this kind of momentum?
Not this quickly. I mean, I believe we had a good message. I believe it would go well, but the pace of it is more than we planned on. So, now we thought it would take longer for us to get to where it was worth somebody's effort to poke holes in us, but that's happened a little more quickly. So it's a good problem to have, but now we've got a responsibility to make sure we're organizing on the ground and then getting ready for any kind of, air war coming our way too.
Air war. Always with the war thing with this guy.
What does that even mean, air war?
I don't know, like getting bad ads.
Air war is when you're reminded that you have some racially charged stuff to deal with in your mayoral
The
past.
air war, which is why I'm here, Reverend, because we fired a black police chief and then his lawyer said I lied about it. Do you know that story?
Yeah.
Yeah, break that down. That's fucking wild.
Yeah, so basically there was... Do you want the whole context with the tapes and everything?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, whatever. Yeah, take it.
It was TYT Investigates.
Yeah,
right,
that was
right.
TYT Investigate. Was that Klippenstein?
Jonathan Larson, who's the head of the Investigates team.
Yeah.
So what they found, now, just to give you context prior to Pete Buttigieg, holding office in South Bend, there was an issue where police officers, South Bend Police Department, were caught on tape saying terrible racist things about the police chief at the time. And the police chief at the time was the first African-American police chief in South Bend, Indiana. And so the director of communications for the police department came across the tapes and was concerned about it. And so she draws attention to it. And then at some point in the middle of this whole, kerfuffle, Pete Buttigieg gets elected. And so everything that he did in handling it after that seems to be a little disastrous. First off, the people of South Bend, and at this point, everyone on a national scale wants to hear those tapes. They want it to be released. And so the argument is, there's been a number of arguments. Oh, well, there was some concern that they were recorded in an unlawful way. or no, we can't release it because we're in the middle of an investigation and it could hurt the prosecution. But how could it hurt the prosecution? I mean, the prosecution needs to hear those tapes in order to decide what to do with these cops.
Right.
But either way, in the middle of all of this, Buttigieg decides to first fire. He tried to fire the police chief who was targeted in those tapes with all the racist comments. And then when the police chief said, no, I'm not gonna step down, Buttigieg decided to demote him. So that was one of the issues. The communications director for the police department was eventually fired. Why did she get fired? And then there was one other woman in the TYT Investigate story who also got fired. But there were just a number of weird issues surrounding Buttigieg's actions. And it appeared that he was attempting to protect the police officers in question. Now, this is a story that's still developing, and I'm still open to, a possible outcome that doesn't make him seem like he's a terrible person. But right now, he's looking pretty bad.
Well, and the thing that I also heard today, and again, you need to follow up on, but that his excuse for firing the police chief was that he was under an FBI investigation. That's his latest excuse.
Right.
The police chief's attorney, okay, it's his attorney, sure. Although I have to say, like, attorneys might spin. Attorneys don't usually lie about something like that. His attorney just was like, no, he wasn't.
Yeah, so...
Which is extra. Like, if he actually was that bold and that, I mean, we don't know, but that's an incredible discrepancy.
Right. Buttigieg first said something along the lines of, oh, there was misconduct. And it was super vague. It just seemed like there was something shady going on. Then I heard an excuse about how, oh, he was mistreating his subordinates. And so who are his subordinates and how exactly did he allegedly mistreat them? Are we talking about the police officers in question who are on those
like,
tapes?
hey, stop saying racist stuff about me.
Right.
Whoa.
Yeah, I don't know.
Right,
That's the thing. There
Right,
are
we don't
all
know.
sorts of weird, vague answers from Buttigieg, but I think that it's also indicative of who Buttigieg is overall when it comes to this whole race, because he's vague about everything, right? He refuses to be specific in terms of policy. He refuses to be specific in terms of, what he stands for. And maybe decades ago that would be okay and you can run on your so-called values, whatever that means. But in reality, we're in a completely different political era where people are super aware of what you stand for, what your policies are, whether or not you're lying about your support for something like Medicare for All. And Buttigieg has never said he's in favor of Medicare for All. I'm just using this as an example. You have a bunch of politicians who say, yeah, I'm in favor of Medicare for All. But people are so aware of what's going on that they'll follow up and they'll see, the statements that follow. And usually the statements that follow in interviews is, well, maybe a public option. And there's a bunch of equivocating and stuff like that. So I don't know. Buttigieg just... he annoys me, but the media and the way that they treat him annoys me more because they prop him up.
Right. And I think that was a point I made to you before, right? Is that he is in the sweet spot, like in this establishment, elite, I'll even say liberal and coastal, whatever. Like their version of superficiality, which they don't understand to be superficiality, but it is.
Mm-hmm.
It's superficial to obsess about where somebody went to college. It's superficial to obsess about, again, I wish I spoke multiple languages. That's cool. But that isn't like...
That's not going to make my healthcare affordable.
Yeah, it's not going to get you healthcare. It's not going to get college. It's not going to cancel debt. It's not going to cut military spend. It doesn't fucking matter. Their signifiers, their versions of superficiality are so deep with this guy.
Totally.
And it's kind of disgusting to watch.
It is disgusting. As you were making that point, I was thinking of a meme that I came across, and it's just it's a meme that has almost like a split picture. One side is Buttigieg, the other side is Beto O'Rourke.
Right.
And it just says the I don't really follow politics starter pack. Right?
That's so good.
Because that whole they're young and they're dynamic and they stand on tables when they're making their points. Like those are the superficial things that the media loves and, some uninformed Democratic voters love as well. It's like, oh, but he's charismatic. I don't care. I don't
Right.
care. Obama was super charismatic. He was a great speaker. I remember being at the DNC in 2008 and I almost cried
Right.
out of like happiness, and I was so inspired. But what did he deliver? And you know, that incrementalism is not enough. We need more, especially after the Trump administration.
And if you don't deal with the conditions that led to Trump, you can get rid of Trump. See, that's the thing. The last thing I say about this is it's like, the question is deep. Like, I think there's a very good chance that Trump will go in 2020 because he's incredibly unpopular and he's a milk brain, right? And even like, I think there's an argument to be made that maybe literally Hillary Clinton was the only person that could have lost to Donald Trump, right? I think there's an argument you could make. Now, he might win. I'm not like, don't get optimistic about that. But that being said, if you put Beto O'Rourke in office, if you put Buttigieg in office, if you put Joe Biden in office, if you put Kamala Harris in office, if you put, you know, any of the other, you know, not Sanders, not Warren. And I would make a distinction, by the way, between Sanders and Warren, but that's a whole other debate. But you're not going to address the underlying, like, Macron's in power, France is in fucking disaster.
Yep.
And the Front National is still a major threat. So what happens in 2022 and 2024 after you've unburdened yourself of just the fact that this, you know, grotesque thing is president? And I get it.
Yeah.
We all want this guy to go. He's disgusting. But if you don't get rid of those conditions, you'll have Trump-like things. And I think that is the debate inside the Democratic Party.
I hope that's a debate.
Right.
I'm worried that...
Or inside us.
Yes,
Maybe not
yes.
the party, but those of us who are voting in this
Yes.
primary or
Definitely,
whatever.
definitely. I think
Yeah.
that's the debate happening right now among those who want real reform, real change, and those who just want to go back to the way things were because their nostalgia is more important to them than improving the conditions for working class and middle class Americans. And again, going back to the point that I made during our live show, the media keeps, and even people in the media that I tend to like and most of the time agree with, they keep making this point for Trump that's completely fabricated. It's completely false, that the economy is doing really well. And, you know, Biden's the nominee. He's going to have a tough time making his case because the economy is doing really well. No, it's not. No, it's not.
Right.
I don't care about the GDP.
Absolutely.
I don't care about how well the stock market. I mean, I do to some extent. But what I want to know is, all right, well, what are middle class and working class Americans making right now? What are their wages? Especially relative to inflation. Are people able to afford housing? No, they're not. People are really struggling. And this is not whining and crying about it. This is not asking for a handout. It's asking for our taxpayer money to actually go back to the American people and help us, right? Rather than push for regime change in Venezuela. How much are we going to spend on that?
How much have we already spent?
Exactly.
Exactly. And just the amount of wealth concentration is just incompatible with democracy, let alone socialism.
Exactly,
Right? Like,
yeah.
you could worry about the D part of that equation. We're going to go to the post game. We're going to talk about Joe Biden. We're going to make fun of this. Did you see this woman who did a New York Times regime change propaganda video for Venezuela?
No.
And she's just like an internet comedian, and they didn't reveal that her dad is like a major figure in the opposition.
Oh.
And then when it was called out, her dad was like, "You're being sexist."
Oh, come on.
Of course. So she's back, and we're going to talk about her. She's in the bad segment. Ben Burgess, bad, not good for you. Ben Burgess is going to do a debunk, and then, we'll get to everything else. So, guys, become a patron today, patreon.com/TMBS. That's how you get all of it. Anna, thanks a million.
Thank you.
Awesome to do this. Thanks, guys. Thanks, everybody on the team. Appreciate all of you. See you in the postgame.